Well, I'm really glad to be with you all today, and this is usually about the time in the Institute or in these workshops where people start to have serious doubts about, because they've heard all the different challenges that come up for the movements, and they're thinking, can this really work? Can civil resistance really work? And one of the conditions under which people have doubts about civil resistance being able to work is in the context of brutal violence. And I'm going to borrow an anecdote from my friend Ivan Marovich, who told me this story when we were in Oslo a few weeks ago. He said that Niels Bohr, the Dutch or Danish physicist who came up with atomic theory and a bunch of things on quantum mechanics, he was having a visitor at his farmhouse in the countryside, and the visitor noticed that he had a horseshoe over his door and came in and said, "Professor Bohr, what is this?" And he says, "Well, it's a horseshoe." And he says, "Do you really believe in that stuff?" And he said, "No, of course I don't believe in that stuff. It's good luck or whatever. I don't believe in it." And he said, "Well, then why do you have it over your door?" And he said, "They say it works even if you don't believe in it." So just keep thinking about that in the context of civil resistance. Obviously it's important to sort of have some expectation of success before one engages in any type of strategic activity, but it's okay to have doubts too. In fact, one of the sort of key things that I've found out about civil resistance and the people that participate in it over the past couple of years is that they often have no idea how things are about to play out. But when we take a look at the data in the long term and look retrospectively at how these things have played out, we can draw some really important conclusions that might help them to manage their expectations about it. So let me tell you the two kind of big reservations that I had when I first came to this field. And I didn't come to this field as somebody that was at all a believer in nonviolent resistance or nonviolent struggle. I came to this field as somebody who'd pretty much only spent my time studying violent phenomena, trying to understand it, trying to figure out how states crush it, etc. And so these are the sort of things that I had in my mind that I think are kind of reiterated all over the world. And so the first is that, if you're using nonviolent methods, if you're relying on a body of unarmed civilians to prosecute your conflict for you, then they can't succeed against a highly brutal, repressive opponent. And then the second thing that is often thought is that repression forces a nonviolent movement to adopt violence to protect itself or to continue its goals. So let me talk a little bit about a couple of matters that come up around this. So read this quote really quickly. Julius Caesar, that's a good guess. Who said this? Guesses. It wasn't Julius Caesar. Another guess. Yeah. Okay. Anybody want to throw some names out who you think it might be? Yeah. Hitler? You're right. Yeah. Adolf Hitler said this in 1943. And in this context, he was referring to the conquered regions, those being occupied in Europe by the Nazi Party at the time. And one of the things that comes out of this notion, it's quoted in a very good article by a guy named Ralph Summey, who wrote an article in 1994 called Nonviolent Struggle and the Extremely Brutal Opponent. And the point he's trying to get at here is that even people that seem to be willing to deploy horrendous levels of violence against other people in order to maintain power will privately admit to themselves and their subordinates that that's not going to hold them in power forever, that they can't repress all the people all the time. And in fact, if we go back to Gene Sharp's concept of power, he kind of makes four key assumptions that are crucial to understanding why it is that brutal opponents know they can't be brutal forever and maintain power. The first is that power is not based on the monopoly of force, or the ability to constantly deploy force to subdue people, but instead that people voluntarily consent and obey. So if you buy into that, then what this means is that when an opponent has to resort to violence, it already displays that they're weak. They're weak in terms of their legitimacy. They have to expend resources to maintain the status quo, which means it taps into their capacity. It's much easier if people are just compliant, without resistance. The third major assumption that Sharp makes is that no regime, especially if we're talking about regimes, is monolithic. And I would actually extend that out to any different type of opponent. No opponent is monolithic unless you're talking about a single person. They usually can't do a ton of damage without some obedience, cooperation, and help of the so-called pillars of support. So if we're talking about a government, for example, pillars are going to be things like the security forces, the economic elites, the civilian bureaucrats, the sort of intelligentsia of the society, religious elites, state media. All of these different pillars are compliant and cooperating with that ruler's ability to stay in power. And this could be extended to corporations as well. Hardy showed you yesterday that during the strategy and tactics session, all of the different pillars that the grape farmers were dependent upon, or the grape corporations were dependent upon to maintain the status quo. So every kind of source of power or power holder relies on people, essentially, to maintain the status quo. And because of that, power is impermanent. It has to be constantly replenished. And the cheapest way to do this is through just accepted legitimacy. So essentially, this argument is suggesting that for civil resistance to work, instead of kind of confronting the opponent on its own terms and at the center of the power holder's source, instead what civil resistance does is it starts to pull away those pillars of support. So it starts to impose costs upon the civilian bureaucrats for maintaining the status quo. It starts to impose costs on economic elites or business elites, like in the South Africa case. It starts to make it too costly to continue to repress in the ways that repression is exercised by, for instance, spreading out where people are located and say, a stay-at-home demonstration. Very hard to repress a stay-at-home demonstration. It's not impossible, it's done, but it costs a lot of money. They have to pay their security forces overtime. They have to ask them to take personal risks, go into the homes of people that they may know, who their kids' friends, they go to the same school with their kids' friends or so forth, and they have to kind of reckon with the fact that this might have to happen over the long term. And so a civil resistance movement, as it gains in the number of participants and the diversity of participants that are engaged in the struggle, it starts to put more pressure on these different pillars of support and places them in a position where they may reevaluate their own strategic calculations and their own interests. So let me talk a little bit about this vis-a-vis the data. So this is a slide that comes out of my book with Maria Stephan. And what we're looking at here is the effects of popular participation, that is active civilian participation in a resistance movement, on the probability that the movement will succeed. And by success here, we mean they remove a leader from power, that they secede and become an independent state, or that they kick out a foreign military occupation. So what we're looking at here is that as the number of participants increases relative to the size of the overall population, the chances of success go way up. In fact, there's a well-known political scientist named Mark Lichtbach who argues for the so-called 5% rule. The 5% rule is that no opponent can sustain the status quo in the face of a challenge of 5% of the population. That's all that's required. And our data actually substantiate this, that over the long term, if 5% or more of the population is engaged in struggle against an opponent, that the opponent must do something about it. They must either concede or they must basically collapse. So what we also found is that nonviolent campaigns, on average, in the history of nonviolent campaigns from 1900 to 2006, of this maximalist nature, they're on average 4 times larger than the average violent campaign. Nonviolent campaigns are much better at eliciting people power. That is, the active participation of people from all walks of life with varying risk profiles and who can generally, use their personal relationships in the society to put pressure on those pillars of support. Now, the way this comes down, if you want to take a look at how this kind of shifts those calculations, this slide is showing you the effects of participation on security force defections. Now, security force defections are one of many different types of loyalty shifts within the pillars. You can get economic shifts, civilian bureaucrats leaving office. You can get state media that switch or just simply stay home. They just don't go to work and they engage in non-cooperation. But either way, what this is demonstrating on the left side is that if you have a violent campaign, there's actually a much lower likelihood that security forces defect, even as the size of the movement increases. This is because they feel threatened, and generally they shoot back when they're shot at. This is different with nonviolent campaigns, whereas you can see the larger the campaign gets, the more likely the security forces are to defect. And by this, we mean that they either switch sides or they simply don't show up or disobey orders to fire on protesters or to go door to door and engage in repression. Yeah.
Why is there a drop-off after 1.5%?
Yeah, those are just a couple outlier cases. I can't remember exactly. Oh, those are China, all 3 of them, actually. Okay, so I want to get you guys to throw out a couple ideas. If you can put yourself in the context of, say, security forces that are asked to go out and repress a nonviolent movement, what is the repression for? What is the purpose of it? Yeah.
Establish public order.
Okay, so okay. To restore order, or you can think about this as quiet, right? Stability. Yeah. To scare the living bejeebus out of people. Why do you want to scare them? So it stops. So in other words, you're using fear so that you don't have to use repression, because it's cost something to use repression. So just scare the bejeebus out of people, and then you won't have to try to use your repression and see how vulnerable you really are.
To sustain status quo.
Yeah. What else? Forced compliance. And obedience, right? Huh? Yeah, to show who's boss.
Appease hardliners.
That's it. Appeasing hardliners. Sometimes some of these people are highly reluctant to use force, but they've got some personal survival at stake here, and there are hardliners within the opponent that are saying, you're going to do this or we're going to get rid of you, right? So they have to do it to sort of demonstrate to their own side that they mean business. What else? Yeah.
Maintain power. Political gain.
Yeah, maintain power. Political gain. Sometimes it's highly popular publicly to engage in repression against certain portions of the population, particularly minorities. Yeah?
Support the financial interests of the ruling class.
Yeah, financial interests. 2 more and then we're moving on. Yeah?
Sometimes they know no other tactic.
Yeah. Because you're used to it. This is our toolkit. This is our repertoire. I don't know. French speakers can crucify me. What's that? Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Good.
Sometimes because they actually hate.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Acting out personal ambitions, I guess.
Sometimes they hate, and it can be related to an ideology.
Well,
And
because they've been taught. I mean, in
exactly.
South America, the military forces were recruited from poor people, poor boys, and told them these were traitors and communists and
Yep.
stuff.
Exactly. Right. So, but the sort of strategic purpose of it is generally to use a minimum amount of force to create a maximum amount of quiet. So you don't want to have to, if you're the opponent, you don't want to have to deploy too much force because you're wasting resources. You want to deploy just enough to basically scare people into submission, and teach them a lesson. Now, the thing is that this assumes that regimes are monolithic. But if you accept Sharpe's definition of power, no regime or no opponent is actually monolithic. So even if a leader says, this is what we want to do, and we've socialized people so that they will do it, that doesn't mean it's going to work every time. And in fact, leaders will privately admit that one thing they're the most scared of is deploying their security forces and finding out that they don't obey them. So they're always kind of facing this tricky balance for themselves and figuring out when they send out the troops. In fact, one of my colleagues, a guy named Colin Hendricks, has been examining protests and state response in Africa, and he found some strong evidence in a couple of cases to where the government didn't repress some of the protests precisely because it was afraid that if it sent security forces in that they would switch their loyalty and that would open up a whole new ball of wax. So sometimes the absence of repression also might show some weakness. It might show a threat to the other side. So here's this question. Does it actually work? What are the effects of repression? Well, this is a slide that Lee Smithy, who's one of our other academic advisors, allowed me to use to show you kind of some of the previous literature about the relationships between repression and mobilization. So one of the most accepted conventional wisdoms, and I'd say the one that most of these opponents accept themselves, is that the more repression, the less mobilization. So that's the one there at the top left-hand corner. Oberschall, Jenkinson-Pero, Charles Tilley, and others. The idea here is that there's a linear effect. The more repression there is, the more risk there is to mobilization, the less people come out and participate in any type of collective action.
When you say mobilization, you mean involvement?
Yeah, so the way they define it is active participation or involvement in protests. They only look at protests. So then you have, I'm getting there. What? I think I know what you're going to say. Do you want to say something? Okay. So the second group of scholars came in and said, actually, we don't really observe that linear relationship between repression and mobilization. We actually see what they call the inverted U, because we like to make up terms like that. The inverted U, or the upside down U, where repression is very low, people aren't really that upset. These are generally going to be your freer societies, and so they're not mobilizing because they're happy. They're really happy. Then in contexts where repression is very high, yes, indeed, we probably won't see a lot of people taking those risks. But in those middling levels where repression is kind of around the center, that's where you're going to see a lot of mobilization. People are pushing the envelope. They're taking advantage of the opportunity to where the regime is either very inconsistent in its application of repression or it's incompetent when it does it. So then if you go down to the lower right-hand corner, you see one argument that maybe it's actually a normal U shape, where there's a ton of mobilization and very free, non-repressive societies, and there's a ton of mobilization and highly repressive societies because people actually mobilize around grievances rather than opportunity. And in very kind of open societies, it's very pluralistic. Everybody's got a problem that they want to air out. And then there's also highly repressive societies where everybody's pissed off. And then if you go to the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a couple of arguments saying, actually, there's a strong linear positive relationship between repression and mobilization, because repression, regardless of the costs that impose on people, angers more people. And that's the sort of backfire effect that has the opposite effect of what it intended. Now, when we put all these studies together and we actually look systematically across cases at the effect of repression, this is what it looks like. And if you're into social science at all, that means there's no relationship. A straight line like that means it's not significantly different from zero. There is no general pattern of the relationship between repression and mobilization. There are a couple other problems that get into basically civil resistance here. The first is that none of these studies really look at the strategic position of the campaigns vis-a-vis their opponents and sort of what's required politically in order for them to win. They all assume that states can repress anytime they want to without having to worry about defections or loyalty shifts within the pillars of support. None of these studies that I just mentioned differentiate between nonviolent struggle and violent struggle. They only look at protest, and they don't discriminate between whether that protest is violent or not. And so, as we know from what we've studied, there are hundreds of methods of nonviolent struggle alone that are available to bring to bear against opponents. Many of them are much lower risk than protest. And then the final thing is that none of these models, none of the findings from before, have incorporated any notion of agency or strategic choice by the campaign to essentially make use of repressive incidences to further their mobilization. So let me talk quickly through three different kind of empirical findings that help us understand this complexity. The first comes from this piece by Ralph Summey that I mentioned, and all of these are going to be available on the e-classroom for you. So Summey's argument is that basically you have to look at the strategic position of the campaign relative to its opponent to understand what's required to win. He argues that even when the opponent is extremely brutal, if there is a so-called dependency relationship, meaning that the opponent is directly dependent on the obedience of those it's trying to repress, these kinds of campaigns can win using nonviolent struggle because they are able to grow, mobilize large numbers of people, and draw those pillars of support away from the power source. So examples are going to be Iran. He quotes Denmark and Norway as examples of this, the Nazi occupation of Denmark and Norway, Chile and Serbia. Now he argues that an indirect dependency relationship is where the opponent doesn't depend, its survival doesn't depend on these people. So a lot of times we'll see this with territorial conflicts, like in East Timor or in Tibet, where in Tibet the Chinese government is not going to fall apart if the Tibetans rise up, right? So in these types of contexts, what he argues is that the intervention of a third party that has linkages to the movement is often required in order to succeed using nonviolent struggle. Now this doesn't mean military intervention. It just means third-party support through solidarity networks, building coalitions within the sort of majority population as they did in East Timor, or otherwise figuring out a way to influence or impose costs on the pillars of support that do directly affect the survival of the opponent. Maria, Stephan, and I found in our book that the method of struggle has a very strong effect on whether repression basically influences the long-term effectiveness of the movement. We found in our cases of 323 nonviolent and violent mass struggles that repression does slightly reduce the chance of success. In fact, because we were looking at maximalist struggles, all of them were asking for a fundamental reordering of the system in ways that were going to elicit a violent response from the opponent. So that wasn't too surprising. But the interesting thing that we found is that even under cases of violent repression and brutality, nonviolent campaigns were still outperforming the violent ones by over 2 to 1. That is, 46% of the nonviolent campaigns under these circumstances were succeeding, compared with only 20% of the violent campaigns. And we think there are 2 major reasons for this. The first is related to the maximization of participation. That when you have a few million people engaged in the conflict, it's much easier for the movement to maintain resilience in the face of repression. It's also easier for them to engage in tactical innovations that allow them to evade the repression and maintain their disruptive capacity. Let me give you an example. So in Iran, the Iranian Revolution of 1978 to 79, people call it the 100 Days Revolution. And the first 90 or so days were mostly what you might call tactics of concentration, or what Hardy would call methods of commission. Things like protests, street demonstrations, funeral processions, rallies, and the like. Now, these are great for some purposes. They raise the profile of the movement. They often draw in other supporters. And they also have vulnerabilities. They're very vulnerable to repression. They can become very predictable. They can become so ordinary that it doesn't really surprise people, and after a time the sort of disruptive ability goes down. So what happened in the last 10 or so days of this uprising was an oil workers' strike. And the oil workers' strike overlapped with a stay-at-home demonstration. So instead of just surrounding demonstrators in the street and sniping them, the Shah's security forces actually started going door to door to pull the oil workers back out into the street, march them down the street, and take them to the oil fields. And when they got there, they worked at half pace. Day after day, this happened. And after the probably 4th or 5th day, some of the security forces said, we're not going to get our paychecks next month, basically, because they thought that the Shah's main source of revenue was the oil revenue, and that shutting down those oil fields meant that they weren't going to get paid, and they were not going to continue going door to door and repressing these people, who they didn't really like, but they knew they'd probably have to live with after the Shah falls. And so they just called in sick. And then they, as soon as a few people start calling in sick, everybody thinks that's a pretty good idea. I'll call in sick too. And it didn't actually matter that, indeed, the Shah had enough money to pay them overtime. They didn't know that. They didn't need to know. All that had to happen is that their strategic calculations were shifted, and this kind of good strategic sequencing of tactics from methods of commission to methods of omission, where the repression was spread out and therefore very costly and personal, led to the end of that revolution and the departure of the Shah from the country. The other thing that we found is that repression against nonviolent movements is much more likely to backfire than repression against violent movements. And what we mean by this is that the object of the repression, to restore order, to scare people, to sustain the status quo and force them to comply, doesn't happen. In fact, the opposite happens. So why would repression backfire? Well, Smithy and a few other people argue that repression against nonviolent campaigns can produce a sense of moral shock. And it can actually empower the movement in several ways. The first is by generating icons around which the movement can focus and mobilize. In some contexts, funeral processions may be the only free assembly in a country. And so movements can take advantage of that freedom to grow the participation. Sometimes movement participants become more intensely attached to the movement. It develops more of a community within the movement to be victimized. Now, I want to make very clear that I'm not arguing that movements should deliberately provoke violence against themselves. It reduces their chances of success, as I've mentioned. But the key finding here is that sometimes the repression backfires and can be used by the movement to its advantage. The second thing might happen is that recruitment might happen against sympathetic publics. So more people might be drawn to the movement. For instance, in Serbia, grandparents started participating in the movement when they realized that their presence at demonstrations might protect their grandchildren against police violence. It may also weaken the regime in several ways. It may undermine the regime's legitimacy among its key pillars, and it might also induce divisions among elites in a way that provokes these crucial loyalty shifts, which is sort of the most important element of a nonviolent struggle, is creating those loyalty shifts within the pillars. So Brian Martin argues that movements can actually manage repression to try to kind of bring about the backfiring, but that a few necessary practices need to be followed. The first thing is that the act of repression has to be portrayed effectively by the movement as unjust, unfair, excessive, or disproportional. This may be a reason why nonviolent movements are better at eliciting the backfire than violent ones, because it's easier to depict to broad publics that the act was unjust, disproportional, and excessive relative to what provoked it. The second thing is that the campaign has to actively communicate information about this action to relevant audiences. So in other words, a repressive event is not going to backfire if it happens in secret. It has to be visible and it has to be captured, usually by multiple visual angles, and disseminated in a way that makes clear that it was unjust, unfair, excessive, or disproportional. And then the third thing is that the movement has to have a plan to counter the propaganda and censorship that will inevitably result from this. It's very typical that opponents will say two things right away when they repress a nonviolent campaign. One, they were terrorists and they used violence. And number two, they were foreigners. So those are the two pieces of propaganda that pretty much any campaign can expect right off the bat, and that have to be managed in a way, or strategies to counteract that propaganda are necessary, usually through witnessing and through verification through third-party media, independent media, and the like. Peter?
One subtle point is that when you have an authoritarian regime that's repressing a violent regime, you have very, very understandable borders and behaviors. So you're basically repressing a regime that's threatening all the people that are doing the repressing. When an authoritarian is repressing a nonviolent movement, many of the people in the regime that are nonviolent, but who suddenly might lead people to believe their loyalty isn't perfect, suddenly find themselves more easily in the other category and suddenly find their risk of maintaining their loyalty much greater. It's just not a matter of moral outrage, it's a matter of disrooting their own sense of where their own protection is.
Exactly. Yeah.
You have a question about when the repression becomes economic, which is not as visible. For example, in Mexico City, there was recently protests at the National University, which is where I work, and a lot of the professors are actually sympathetic to the protesters, but we received a mass email saying all pay is suspended for all employees until the protest ends. And so a lot of people felt extremely financially desperate, especially with children, and people just started acting in ways that, even though it's kind of an action that's very repressive, that's not necessarily visible, that divides people.
Yeah, I think that's quite common, with strikes, for example, and other things where, if you just try to hit people's wallets, that's a way to try to divide them. And so a lot of movements will try to develop, ways to counteract the effects of that kind of action by, in the case of strikes, they'll develop strike funds or other economic alternatives. They'll, share resources and this sort of thing to try to counteract the effects of that kind of action. But yeah, I mean, the bottom line here is that whichever side is better at divide and rule probably wins. But that doesn't mean that the opponent is always going to be better at dividing and ruling. I mean, a lot of times they're fairly incompetent, disunited themselves, and it's not obvious from the beginning, but it becomes obvious as the thing unfolds. We'll take a couple more points, then I have to move on. Yeah.
The opponent can be perceived of as a coalition, and all the points that I made about what increases coalition strength or decreases coalition strength applies to the opponent as well.
Right. 2 more points, then we got to go on. Yeah.
A ver, un poco la experiencia en Cochabamba nos ha mostrado algunas cosas, ¿no?
A little bit the experience in Cochabamba has demonstrated a few things to us.
Todo lo que tú has dicho yo estoy de acuerdo, que ha sido muy rápido.
Everything that you've said a lot very quickly, but I agree with everything you've said.
Creo que quienes ordenan la represión,
I think that those who order the repression
muchas veces no son ya los gobiernos ni los estados.
Many times aren't the states or governments anymore.
Right.
No, entonces es más difícil el poder enfrentar un proceso de represión.
So it's more difficult to confront a process of repression.
Creo que tiene que ver además también con el contenido de la movilización.
I think it has to do a lot with the content of the mobilization.
Es muy diferente formar una coalición grande.
It's more difficult to form a big coalition
cuando tú estás defendiendo, por ejemplo, la privatización de la empresa telefónica.
When you're defending, for example, the privatization of a telephone company.
Que es muy diferente a la privatización del agua.
Which is very different than the privatization of the municipal water supply.
Afecta a todos, ¿no?
Which affects everybody equally.
En Cochabamba se presentó algo muy interesante, lo que tú dices.
In Cochabamba, something presented itself that was very interesting, similar to what you're saying.
El gobierno ordenó para reprimir Cochabamba a que vengan policías de otro estado.
The government ordered police from another state to come to Cochabamba to effect the repression.
Y la gente decía, nosotros queremos que nos reprima nuestra policía, no la policía de otro lado.
And the people said, if we're going to be repressed, we want our own police to repress us, not the police from another state.
Y eso aumentó la indignación, ¿no?
And this actually increased people's sense of indignation.
Ahora, la represión tiene que ver con quienes están en la movilización.
And the repression has to do with who's involved in the mobilization.
Si están solamente los obreros de una fábrica o está la población, están niños, ancianos, mujeres, jóvenes, hombres.
Who's involved in the repression? Is it just workers from one factor, or is it people from all elements of society, young people, old people, children, etc.?
Entonces, el ejército no puede disparar a una barricada fácilmente.
On a barricade with all those people, the army can't shoot at them so easily.
Y también depende de estas formas de resistencia pacífica, como tú dices, ¿no?
So it also depends on these forms of passive resistance, as you're saying.
Nosotros soportamos durante 5 meses represión de toda forma, ¿no?
For 5 months we had to put up with all sorts of different kinds of repression of every type.
Al final no sabíamos ya qué táctica utilizar para seguir resistiendo.
At the end we understood which tactic to use in which moments in order to keep resisting.
Entonces nuestra táctica fue colocar una barricada en cada puerta en toda la ciudad.
Our tactic was putting a barricade in front of every single door of every single house in the entire city.
Entonces eran miles y miles de barricadas.
So there were thousands and thousands of barricades.
El ejército y la policía estaba imposibilitado de poder caminar por las calles.
The army and the police couldn't even walk through the streets.
Entonces realmente se constituyó un poder del pueblo ahí.
So really we constructed a true entity of power from the people there.
La gente mandaba en ese territorio.
People ruled in this territory.
Era 1 millón de personas ahí.
There was 1 million people there.
El gobernador renunció.
The governor resigned.
El alcalde se ocultó.
The mayor had to hide out.
El ejército y la policía se encerraron en sus cuarteles.
The army and the police went and hid in their barracks.
Y no había represión.
And there was no repression.
Es decir, se había desmantelado toda esa estructura de quienes ordenan represión y quienes reprimen.
In other words, we had dismantled this entire structure of who was sending the repression and who was actually doing the repression.
Sí.
Yeah, that's great. And actually you bring up a really important point I wanted to make as well, which is that there are times when savvy repression means that the opponent can't rely on its own troops, right? So they'll bring in the troops from another country even to do the repression. Or they'll rely on a highly loyal ethnic minority to do the repression against an ethnic majority, right? And so in cases like this, I would say that it's a bad idea to confront these authorities. And so that in general, it's making an assessment of whether these pillars are even vulnerable to being shifted. And if not, focus on a different pillar, right? So trying to avoid confrontation, open confrontation with repression is a good idea in general, especially if these are pillars that are very difficult to impose costs on from the movement. So for example, in the Iran case, and I mentioned the Iranian Revolution from 2007 to 2009, but then we had the Green Movement in 2009, which wasn't entirely urban, but was mostly urban, intellectuals, leftists, etc. And in this type of context, the movement's focus on urban elites and intellectuals and leftists and students made it easier for the security forces to repress them. They love to repress us. I mean, look how we dress. So basically, the 1978 through 79 Iranian Revolution was much more diverse and much more rural. Conservatives participated, and it was therefore easier to get these crucial defections. Let me take one more comment, and then I have to move on because I have to share my time with Stephan as well. Yeah.
I mean, when you talk about censorship and propaganda, it is very high in Tibet. And recently, me and some of our friends, what we decided to do is we decided to create a profile in Weibo, because in Tibet, Facebook is blocked. Weibo is a Chinese site which functions like a Facebook and Twitter. So we decided to create a profile in that and then share the information like non-violent strategic campaign, so that we can convey the message to the Chinese audience and the Tibetans inside Tibet who use Chinese language.
Question: How did you deal with the censorship on the paper?
Because in terms of the issues, political issues that are banned in Tibet. So like when we create a Weibo, it is run by Chinese government, and most of the members in Weibos are the Chinese and the Tibetans. So because if I post on Tibet issue on Facebook, obviously Facebook is blocked, it's not allowed in Tibet, so people will not get the information. And if I use the Facebook, Weibo, people have access to all this.
Wasn't that deleted automatically by the server?
But then what we decided to do is we just create a fake ID and not obvious about the information saying the Dalai Lama of Free Tibet, but then share the information about the tactics and non-violent strategic campaigns, so that definitely it doesn't sound too obvious of political, but also convey the message that's important in our movement.
Great. Okay, we have to move on, but if you have questions, we'll hopefully get to them at the end. And if we don't, please write them on your sheet of paper so we can do it in the World Cafe. So let me talk a little bit about some of the strategic options that are available. These aren't all of them either. But there's this claim out there that if there's repression against a nonviolent movement, you have to shift to violence, right? So that, and many movements have this serious conversation, and actually it divides many movements, this conversation. So here are some other options besides responding with violence. One of them is shifting nonviolent methods. So I've talked about the sort of methods of concentration, which have their uses. They're not the only methods. Methods of dispersion are also pretty good, like people staying at home, switching off the power for an hour every night at the same time, banging on pots and pans, singing, striking, doing sit-ins, demonstrations, and other things. Can be highly disruptive, actually, especially economically, and are available, and they're much lower risk. You can get people who are low-risk participants to sit at home on their couch for 3 days instead of having to go out in the streets, for example. The second thing that can be done, of course, is maintaining the status quo, sticking to a certain strategic plan, but trying to manage the effects of repression by eliciting a backfire effect, or just crossing your fingers and hope that something works out in your favor. I think a lot of movements actually do that. Not so sure it's the best idea, but it's an option. Retreat, that's my personal favorite because I'm a total coward. So actually removing oneself from the repression, trying to regroup. I mean, sometimes it's okay to lose a battle if it's going to help you win the war in the long run. Any military strategist will tell you that retreat, tactical retreat, is an option that's always on the table, just to regroup and try to come up with a plan for how to proceed after a certain repressive incident. And then, of course, responding with violence is an option. Howard's going to talk a lot about the effects of the radical flank. I don't want to steal any of his thunder, but I'll just tell you that in research that Kurt Schock and I have done, we found that movements with radical flanks are less effective in getting what they want than movements that do not have radical flanks. Violent flanks, that is. And he'll tell you all about why. So the bottom line, here are the 4 points that are the takeaways from this presentation for you. The first thing, violence is typical. That doesn't mean it's justified, of course, but it's typical against movements that are seeking major systemic change. The second point, very important, repression can hurt these campaigns, and I recommend avoiding it or evading it whenever possible. But that doesn't mean that it dooms the campaign when it happens. In fact, nonviolent campaigns still outperform violent ones and mixed campaigns when they are repressed. And so the last thing is that there are strategic choices and ways to prepare to manage the effects of repression on a movement. So with that, I'll leave you with the wonderful Stephan Zunes.
Okay. Thanks so much, Erica. I mean, it's so amazing to have someone with Erica's academic, pedigree that can do, crunch the numbers and have the data to back up what people like me, using more qualitative analysis, have been arguing for quite a few years. I want to start by an observation that when faced with severe repression and violence, nonviolent methods cannot always work on a tactical level, but can be remarkably successful on a strategic level. In other words, if heavily armed paramilitaries enter a village and start shooting everyone in sight, I don't think that me or Erica or Jack or Peter or Gene Sharp or Mahatma Gandhi could provide you with the answer, okay, what do you do in this situation? Though you'd be amazed how many times we get asked those kind of questions. but there are many ways a nonviolent campaign can result in a political transformation where that would no longer be something people would have to contend with. Secondly, there are some pacifist traditions, such as Gandhi, who believe that through one's own act of witness or suffering, you can convert the oppressor to your side. And while that might be theoretically possible, and there have certainly been some individual cases of this, I wouldn't count on it. But however, by denying the opponent cooperation and legitimacy, you could create a situation where they would either be unable to inflict violence against you, or they may find that inflicting the violence does them more harm than good. Indeed, even as Erica mentioned, even the most ruthless regime or armed group is dependent on cooperation. And though it is extremely difficult to overpower a violent opponent, you can still deny the opponent power. The state and its allies almost always have the advantages in terms of arms. Using violence against them engages them at their strongest point. So So to win, you need to, in effect, essentially choose an entire different weapon system, if you want to call it that, altogether. And in other words, nonviolent resistance is the ultimate form of asymmetrical warfare. And refusing cooperation denies the regime its sources of power and legitimacy. Now, of course, there are those who argue that such an analysis is naively pluralistic. They note how social power is deeply rooted in social relationships and patterns of social behavior, and that these are institutionalized over time and are pervasive throughout any given society. And they argue that power is located in social structure in which these patterns exist and are reproduced, such as social classes and, depending on the society, ethnic or religious or other social cultural elements. And people's obedience to rulers, they would argue, is not as much an element of free personal choice, that someone could reverse at will, but a characteristic of the way society is organized. Now, however that may be true, nonviolent resistance can still work if the resistance struggle is able to account for such factors as their own support bases, or the resources available to the opponent, what we call the pillars of support. And the means available of changing these relationships, and so identifying the opponent's power, these structural things, the pillars of support, ideological, structural, et cetera, that you're able to target those. You can crumble or weaken these support pillars enough to bring it down. Now, once you figure this out, and how can you mobilize? But how can you mobilize people, though, to take on those pillars of support? Well, one important aspect is conscientization, and one can only think perhaps of Paulo Freire, the author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and his remarkable efforts at conscientization and empowerment of some of the poorest elements of Brazilian society during the height of that military regime's repression. Last night we were reminded of Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa, and how that work in the 1970s helped pave the way for the civil insurrections that were launched in the 1980s. A second area would be building solidarity and morale. Okay, fear divides people. It makes them untrusting. It creates a sense of powerlessness, isolation. There needs to be a conscious effort to overcome this. And often seemingly apolitical activities can make a huge difference in bringing this together. For example, in the Baltic republics, the embrace of their various folk traditions. There's a wonderful film about Estonia called The Singing Revolution, and how just there's a big choral tradition in Estonia. They have a unique language. And that by singing these traditional songs and coming together to celebrate their culture and their distinct identity from the Soviet Union, they are able to form the basis of the movement that eventually won them independence. I remember visiting Indonesia about a year and a half before the downfall of Suharto. Now, we're talking about incredibly brutal dictatorship. I mean, Suharto had more blood on his hands than Saddam Hussein. When he and these right-wing generals seized power in the mid-1960s, they literally massacred over 500,000 communists and other suspected leftists, and talk about a climate of fear. And yet, in the 1990s, you started to see interesting growth, amazing growth in civil society. Now, in Indonesia, you could not form a non-governmental organization or a civil society organization without registering and getting permission from the state. And so people would organize these seemingly innocuous groups like the Women's Entrepreneurial Society, or the Muslim Youth Soccer League, or something like that, which 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 would teach people leadership skills, which would build a sense of community and identity, and get people organizational experience. And yes, they did the things that they were officially supposed to do, but they also talked about the politics and the analysis and vision and strategy of creating change. And so when the economy tanked in 1998, you had a whole new generation of people who had these kind of organizational skills. They were able to come out and bring down this regime and a nonviolent civil insurrection. Thirdly, there's developing a strong but decentralized organizational network. Now, both parts of this are important. I mean, obviously, having a strong network of mutual support and organization in the face of repression that's pretty obvious. But it also needs to be decentralized, given the likelihood that the arrest or killing or forcible exile of the leadership. Next, training to help maintain nonviolent discipline and to overcome fear. So, just as an infantry in a military organization requires training, including drills to help people think under fire and the like, so do those engaged in nonviolent resistance. And this includes role plays and other simulations. In my 20s and 30s, I took part in scores of trainings, both as a participant and a trainer, in preparation for nonviolent direct action. And even here in the United States, where the consequences were not nearly as great as you would find in a situation of dictatorship or occupation, it still made a huge difference on how people were trained. For example, we would roll up newspapers as batons and start beating people. And how would you react in that situation? Obviously, it didn't hurt like a real billy club would, but it got you to think. And I remember actually talking to someone who was an Episcopal priest who had volunteered to take part in the Selma to Montgomery March in Alabama. And he went through one of those trainings and he realized he couldn't do it. He said, "I'm a football player from Texas, and if someone does that, I just get right back, just a reflex." And it made him realize he could not take part in that. He decided, okay, instead he'll do support work or something else where he's less likely to have to contend with that. So it helps weed out people who realize they either react violently or they get too scared and freak out or whatever. But it enables those to have. To get good at anything, you need exercise. You need practice, and this is so training is really key. And finally, planning of appropriate strategies and tactics. So, in order to be successful, the forms of nonviolent resistance against those willing and able to inflict extreme violence, must be different than movements challenging those less prone to do so. Just as a guerrilla army would not launch a final offensive when a frontal assault in the Capitol when they first start organized, they start with low risk hit and run operations, or they'll build cadres in some remote areas in the countryside and then kind of build up strength over the years until they eventually are at a position where they could confront the state in a more direct manner. Similarly, it may be unwise for an unarmed resistance to primarily rely on massive street demonstrations initially, especially if you're against a regime that has no problems with gunning people down in large numbers. So again, just to reiterate what Erica said, the idea of general strikes, boycotts, and other measures that minimize such risk, along with efforts at weakening the loyalty of security forces, would presumably be more appropriate in this kind of situations. Now, if I had time, I would love to tell some amazing stories of resistance and some of the of successful resistance against extremely violent regimes. I think I'll only mention one briefly, and that's Bolivia. And because I think it's the least known of these. This was after General Luis Garcia Meza seized power in July of 1980. And in the previous 2 years, the Bolivians people had ousted 2 military dictatorships, the second one of which, that of General Natus Bush, I think only lasted 15 days. But when Garcia Meza seized power, they actually planned it for, I think, up to 8 months. And right after there was a solid victory by a left-wing coalition in July, before they were able to seize power, they launched the coup. And it's interesting, before the golpistas seized the presidential palace, before the golpistas seized the Congress, the first places they went to was the headquarters of the COB, the Trade Union Federation, and started targeting the homes and the offices of leading activists and activist organizations, because they knew that was their biggest threat. They brutally suppressed for about a week. There was a major uprising. People built barricades in neighborhoods, and there were blockades, and again, brutal repression. I mean, they killed more people in those first couple of weeks than in the previous couple of dictatorships going back decades. Incredibly brutal. But what happened was that the resistance started organizing in a more low-key way. They did popular theater. These popular theater going from town to town, again, part of this conscientization, empowerment projects. There are a rolling series of strikes, by miners and others. And they realized that this is going to have to be for the long term. And yet, within a year and a half, they finally were able to bring down the regime. Well, of course, there are quite a number of cases, many of which we'll be looking at this week, of victorious nonviolent civil insurrections. Obviously, there have been many cases that were crushed. And I want to, but I want to start off by what's on one hand is obvious, but needs to be restated, is that virtually any struggle against severely repressive regimes or armed groups is going to be met by violence. People will be killed, possibly in large numbers. However, and Erica probably has the data on this, on average, the numbers of people killed in nonviolent struggles tends to be significantly less than in armed struggles. I remember talking to a Syrian who was justifying the shift to armed struggle towards the end of 2011, saying, in 6 months, we've had 5,000 people killed. But we need those. We need to take up arms to protect the nonviolent protesters from the regime. But of course, what has happened since then? The death toll has skyrocketed. It's well over 90,000 now. That the killings of those engaged in nonviolent action does not prove that nonviolence doesn't work, any more than the killings of those engaged in violent resistance proves that violence doesn't work. I remember when I was an undergraduate in the mid-1970s seeing a film about the armed revolution in Guinea-Bissau, then known as Portuguese Guinea. And I was this left-wing student activist, third world solidarity, and I was really into it and very supportive of the revolution. But I remember seeing the film. The narrator was saying, we in 1960 we had this big demonstration in the capital of Bissau, protesting for our rights, and the Portuguese troops opened fire and killed 32 nonviolent protesters, and that proved that nonviolence didn't work and we had to take up arms. And I remember thinking at the time, well, gee, what if he'd said guerrillas engaged Portuguese troops in a battle and 32 guerrillas were killed? That proves that violence doesn't work and we need to go to nonviolence. It's going to there is going to be lots of violence. Now, the right of armed self-defense against repression is widely recognized, of course, as legitimate. And I would never make, especially as a North American, would never cast moral judgment against those who feel they need to take up arms in the face of severe repression. But the question is, what kinds of resistance strategy will most likely lead to violence against extremely ruthless opponents? And some people say, oh, well, they won because the regime was not ruthless enough. But in many cases, you'll find that the regime actually did order massacres. Marcos in the Philippines ordered his troops to massacre the crowds outside of Camp Crame in Manila. Erich Honecker ordered his troops in East Germany in those final days to massacre the troops. Ben Ali in Tunisia ordered his troops to massacre the hundreds of thousands of people on Guiba Avenue in Tunis, and they refused. So it's not simply the willingness of a dictator to engage in violence, but whether people obey them. But also, but to give the case studies again, I don't have time to do the details. But let me just mention Libya real quick. A lot of people forget that in the first week of the uprising, nonviolent, almost exclusively nonviolent resistance liberated the entire eastern half of the country, and even a few cities in the west, and even a couple of neighborhoods in Tripoli. It was only when they started, and yes, a lot of people were killed, but it was in the hundreds, not the thousands. And it was only when people started taking up arms, it was during those first few days, where you had the mass defections of ambassadors, of the cabinet, even Gaddafi's mistress, and as well as quite a few troops. Unfortunately, a number of those troops brought their arms with them, took up arms. Again, it met Gaddafi at his strongest point, and that's when things started to reverse. And that's when fears of massacre prompted NATO intervention, and et cetera. But another thing that's kind of interesting is, remember that big, long, bloody battle for Tripoli? No, there wasn't any. Why not? Because prior to the rebel forces entering Tripoli, there was a civil insurrection throughout the city, particularly in working-class neighborhoods, that had liberated 80% of the city before the first rebel columns even entered. So once they did enter Tripoli, all they had was a few mop-up operations, like in Gaddafi's compound and elsewhere. And so given the significance and of the nonviolent struggle at the very beginning and very end, it does raise the question, might they have been able to win? Maybe quicker and easier without the 30,000 plus people killed and the 200,000 armed militiamen that are still running around the country inflicting all sorts of damage and the like. If they, it raised the question, was this armed revolution and NATO intervention really necessary?
This action, external action, was also premised on the principle of R2P, the right to protect, and that there had to be somebody certifying the likelihood of an imminent Holocaust in Ghazi area. And the imminence of that Holocaust was based on the expectation of 10,000 deaths. So the odd thing about all this is that the deaths that actually occurred to protect the Holocaust exceeded the deaths that were projected.
Exactly.
To justify the intervention.
Well, what I want to one thing I want to talk about, because I don't think it's being covered elsewhere this week, is I think we've made a good case so far about how nonviolent action can work against centralized authoritarian regimes. What we're seeing more and more is what some people refer to as fragmented tyrannies, where it's not a single oppressor, totalitarian state, but irregular groups, paramilitaries, gangs, other forms of violence. In fact, it's rather interesting, and a lot of people forget, in El Salvador, there was actually a large nonviolent movement between 1979 and 1981, and actually, as part of the low-intensity conflict doctrine of the United States military, they actually advised the Salvadoran government, shooting into crowds doesn't work. It creates this backfire effect, that actually grows the opposition. And instead, what they end up doing was they allow people to protest. Then at 3 o'clock in the morning, in the unmarked cars, they go to the homes of the organizers, kidnap them, and their bodies were found on the road the next day. And then the government could say, oh, it's not our fault. We're caught between the extreme right and the extreme left, and we're trying to make peace. And it gave them a degree of plausible not deniability that allowed Reagan and Congress to keep sending the arms, and the brutal repression continued. But whether it's by decentralizing or privatizing the repressive apparatus as a conscious decision by the autocratic regime, or it's a more spontaneous, chaotic, crazy situation where we have in places like Colombia or the Guatemalan Highlands or Congo or the Niger Delta or other places, it's trickier. It's harder because obviously these paramilitaries, these guys don't care about international opinion. They don't care about a lot of things that a nation state would. However, there's still some important lessons one can learn. That people can recognize they don't need to depend on a government or traditional politics, and they can be mobilized to force change from below. And that violence can be overcome by reducing the legitimacy of the opponent, by driving up the cost of maintaining the status quo, and pulling away defectors, splitting the loyalty. Because even these paramilitaries have to have people who believe in it and have a stake in it. And it is possible to drive them from that. And so let's look at the situation of a classic failed state. How can nonviolence work in a failed state? Where everybody's kind of killing everybody. Well, this is a little diagram I wrote a couple years ago that, let's say you have this incredible social justice and/or endemic corruption that therefore delegitimizes authority and the rule of law, and that creates the violence, what we call the fragmented tyrannies. And that can either lead to an authoritarian government saying, oh, we have to have a coup because we got to get tough, or it could lead just sort of ineffectual, government. And of course, and that of course can results in social injustice. You get this negative feedback loop that just kind of reinforces these really tragic situations that you see in the newspaper that you generally skip over the articles because they're too depressing. But nonviolent action can actually reverse that, because successful strategic nonviolent action campaigns can challenge the violence, can challenge the corruption, challenge the social injustice. That creates alternative loci of power away from the state or the paramilitary or whatever. It empowers civil society, which enables them to strengthen the strategic nonviolent action campaign, and it becomes a positive feedback loop.
Just a quick comment too. I think what Erica said before about sort of non-state or very, very highly repressive groups sometimes saying we're not going to confront them directly, we'll focus on other pillars of our adversary. But another thing just to think about is, remember that tactical mapping tool I showed you yesterday? Even armed insurgent groups, guerrillas, gangs, whoever, you can do that tactical mapping analysis on, and even they depend on key relationships. They need financing, they need sanctuary, places to hide, they need places to train, they need weapons. They depend on relationships too. And anywhere that those relationships intersect with the regular population might be a point where the population might actually be able to intervene.
Well said, thank you. So let me just close by just giving a few examples of nonviolent campaigns against non-state actors in case of extreme violence and intimidation. One of my favorite ones is of Danilo Dolci in Sicily and in southern Italy, where the mafia pretty much ran things. The mob is not a group that you can necessarily convert and see the evils of their ways and worries about public opinion or anything like that, right? But nevertheless, Danilo Dolci, who was a devout Catholic and pacifist, was able to organize sit-ins and blockades and fasts, which publicized it, got a lot of sympathy, support for his cause. He also pioneered this tactic known as reverse strikes. where, for example, a city wanted to build a new water main, but they couldn't unless they hired at inflated prices the mob-controlled, construction company, whatever. So the citizens of the town built it themselves. And this campaign got enormous international, solidarity and pressure, and they won some significant, victories, essentially, breaking the back of the mob's control. There were a number of very inspiring examples from Colombia. There's the Medellin Youth Network back in the 1990s, where people refused conscription in either the armed forces or the rebel armies. There are public burnings of draft cards. When people were in induction centers, they would leaflet encouraging people to resist, and there are these street theater performances and the like. And there's also been this creation of what they called peace communities, where areas in contested regions between the right-wing paramilitaries, the left-wing guerrillas, and the armed forces, where they insist, we are not taking sides. No matter how much you threaten us, we are not going to take sides in this conflict. We refuse to bear arms, refuse to provide any logistical support to any of the armed groups. But also they served as a model for nonviolent conflict resolution and grassroots participatory democratic structures. And the Niger Delta, where you have the oil companies that are ruining the ecology, and causing massive deaths as a result, and where there's been murder and repression of environmental activists. But you also have these armed gangs, that have been inflicting a lot of violence as well. Not in addition to demonstrations, they've actually occupied, often led by women, have occupied the oil platforms that are in shallow waters, just off the coast there. There have been international boycotts against Chevron and some of the other multinational oil companies involved in. And again, this has been much of this has been led by women. More recent development, of course, is the movement for peace, justice, and dignity, and challenging the drug war, both by the Mexican government and by the drug cartels themselves. These the vigils, caravans, rallies, setting out these crosses and other symbols of the thousands of victims. And they've done some good outreach to groups here in the United States, and given the important role the U.S. government has played in the military-led drug war there. But finally, I do want to mention that another way of challenging this kind of violence, and that is what's known as third-party nonviolent intervention. Third-party nonviolent intervention. And that includes where people, generally from outside the country, will come in and essentially be unarmed bodyguards to people who could be vulnerable to assassination and arrest, such as labor leaders, human rights lawyers, and the like. It could be, and also, and even if they fail to protect them, at least they are physically present, to write down the license number of the car, so they can trace it to the government or whatever. Take photographs, videos. Like many of these people have been involved in peace education and nonviolence training, and it also brings international solidarity, because when these people go back to their countries, they can tell people what they've seen and raise awareness. And in the rare event, the tragic event where one of these international covenant people get killed, or seriously injured or whatever, it creates political pressure, from the host government, particularly if it's United States or European country. And there have been some very interesting case studies. I mean, this idea originates actually back in Gandhi's time of trying to stop communal violence between Hindus and Muslims. But there have been some, these are a number of but here are some of the organizations that have been involved in this kind of work. And I'd be happy to, you can check their websites and find more information about them. But they've had a huge difference. I mean, Witness for Peace, for example, went to these border villages in Nicaragua where the U.S.-backed Contras were, crossing the border and massacring, people. But there was not a single attack in any village where they had Americans in the village, because they knew it would be very bad publicity against since the U.S. was arming the Contras. And again, when people were done with their 6-month tour of duty, they would go back and go to their churches, go to their communities, and say, hey, despite what Reagan says, these aren't the moral equivalent of our founding fathers and freedom fighters. These guys are terrorists, and this is what's going on there. And it helped lead the pressure that eventually led to the cutoff of aid, to the Contras. So, a lot more to say. I'll be here through tomorrow evening if you want to check in, with me, and I'll place a little thing where I'll give my website and areas to contact me if you want to follow up on this or anything else. But thank you.